Welcome back to Snowy Owl Knits. Today we're talking about ribbing and the rib stitch, which in general is a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch and a knit stitch and a purl stitch. And it gives you this nice, really squishy, soft, stretchy fabric. But the most important thing I want to discuss with you, as well as how to do the ribbing, is the cast on edge and the bind off edge. And so this using the rib stitch is very good for things like the cuffs of socks or collars, even a whole hat itself. And so you want both edges, your cast off and your bind off, to have the right amount of stretch and to look good with the ribbing itself. In this example, I've done a tubular cast on, which I'll show you here in a minute, and it kind of mimics that actual ribbing stitch. Instead of having, if this were the cast on edge, instead of it having, just lots of loops going on, this one looks like that ribbing just rolls right around the back side of the fabric. So, and in this one, I want to point this out. I just bound this little swatch off in just a regular bind off method that I've showed you before. And you can see it doesn't give very much. See, our cast on edge and the ribbing stretch quite a bit, but this bind off really doesn't give the kind of stretch that you want to go with the rest of your fabric. I've done a couple of other samples here and we'll compare. This was also done using the tubular cast on, and then I did this modified stretchy bind off, which I'll show you later in the video. And you can see here that it is equally stretchy at the cast on and the bind off row. This bind off doesn't mimic the tubular cast on quite as well. It still looks quite pretty and it has that nice stretch. And so I'll be showing you how to do both of those. Let me compare that to another swatch done very similarly. This is also the super stretchy bind off. And I'm pointing that out because here in the modified bind off, this has a lot more flare at the top of it. Yes, it stretches, but it tends to bow out a whole lot more than this modified one. And finally, here is an example of the tubular cast on, the rib stitch, and then what is called a bind off. It's a sewn bind off, and it actually is done in a way that it looks just like the ribbing itself. And so in order to begin, let's start with casting on in this tubular bind off, and then I'll show you the two different ways to go about doing your bind off. Okay, so this method for casting on is slightly unusual because it involves casting stitches on that don't really behave like stitches until you work them once. And so what we're going to do is begin by grasping the yarn as if we were going to do a long tail cast on, and set our needle on top. This time I want you to pivot that needle towards you, and that will be considered the first stitch. And if you look at it from the top, it doesn't have the little bar that would make that look like a purl stitch. So this will be considered a knit stitch. To make the next stitch, we're going to create a purl stitch. And to do that, we go up over the strand on our index finger, underneath the strand on our thumb, let it twist around, and we come right back to the starting position. And if you look at my needle, let me stretch that out just a little bit, you'll see that it has the bar that makes that mimic a purl stitch. So we're going to cast on a number of 12. We have knit, purl, and now we do a knit, and that is done by going underneath the thumb strand, underneath the finger strand, letting it loop around, going back under the thumb strand, and pulling it tight. And there you see we have knit, purl, knit. So then we go back up to the purl. That starts with the index finger. You go under both strands, come up and through the center, and pull down. Purl stitch. Now let's go for the knit. That begins with the thumb strand, and then under the finger strand, and back through the center. So there's 5 stitches cast on. Now we need our purl stitch. Under finger strand, under thumb strand, back up over the thumb strand, and down onto the needle. Let me tighten that up. Now time for a knit stitch. Under both strands, up around that finger strand, and down and around the thumb. Okay, 7 stitches. Need the purl. So under both strands, up over the thumb strand, and loop it back around. Under the thumb, index finger, loop. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Now on this last stitch, this 12th one, let's make sure we have it. We have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. That last stitch that we cast on, this is going to seem strange. We're going to let that come off because it's really not a finished stitch. We're going to make a loop on our thumb, and we're going to just pick up that last strand. It's a backwards thumb cast on. All right, so our tail is kind of hanging out of the way, and if we turn our work and look, you can see that we have what looks like knit and purl. We have a knit stitch, a purl, a knit, a purl, a knit, a purl, and so on and so forth. And so making sure we're not using our tail yarn, we're just going to get a length of yarn, enough to work with. And this first round is a little bit tricky because we don't have fully formed stitches. We have what's considered partially formed stitches. So each one will feel a little bit weird. These like to try to twist around on the needle. So begin by knitting 1 and purling 1. Well, it wants to twist. I'm going to help it along. That's the thing about this. It's beautiful as a stitch, but that first round can be just a little tricky. Knit, followed by purl. And knit. You see how those like to twist up a little bit? Just kind of push them down with your finger. And purl. Get on there. And we just continue, knit one and purl one, and I promise you, after you get this initial row out of the way, it will feel the way it's supposed to feel. These stitches just want to twist and go places that you don't want them to go. Look, and I even split that. And knit. I like using these for hats, but that first round just about does me in sometimes. But it just gives such a good effect that you want to keep using it. And last one is purl. And since that last one was a purl, when we turn it around and go to begin the next row, that purl on the other side is now knit. So it's just knit and purl. Look how much better behaved these stitches are now that I've gotten that initial row out of the way. Knit, purl, and knit, and purl. It takes a couple of rows before you really see how nice your work is looking. The first row or two, you're still wondering, oh my gosh, am I even doing this remotely properly? But as long as you're just paying attention to whether or not you're knitting or purling, you'll be just fine. So I'm going to finish off this row, and then I have on another set of needles 2 swatches that I've finished up, and I'm going to show you the 2 different ways for binding off. Okay. Forgive the needle noise, but here on one set of needles I have 2 swatches. Both have used the tubular cast on, and I'm going to show you 2 methods for binding off your ribbing. The first one will be that modified stretch bind off. If we were to do a super stretchy bind off, we would be adding a yarn over before each stitch on the needle, and that yarn over creates just a little bit extra yarn that allows it to give, and we don't want this to flare out too much. And so to begin, we're just going to knit the first stitch because we're following pattern, and that first stitch is a knit stitch. So before every purl stitch, we have a purl stitch on the needle, we're going to do a yarn over. And if you haven't done one before, now is just a really good place to learn it. Basically, all we're doing is wrapping the yarn counterclockwise around your needle before the next stitch. And if we were to just leave it undone, that yarn over would become a decorative hole in the fabric. But we're going to take care of that right away. So we have our knit stitch, we have the yarn over, and then we purled a stitch. Now we're ready to bind off. We're going to take the first 2 stitches up and over that purl stitch, leaving the purl stitch in place. The next stitch coming up on our needle is a knit stitch, and we do not do the yarn over there. We just go ahead and knit that stitch and bind off by pulling the second stitch over the first. We have a purl stitch here, so we're doing the yarn over. Wrap it counterclockwise, bring your yarn back to the front, and purl that stitch. And pass these 2 stitches over the first stitch on your needle. If you prefer, you can pull those off one at a time. It's the same motion. So here we go, we just had a knit stitch, so we didn't do the yarn over. We just bind off as normal. There's a purl stitch, so we get the yarn over, yarn to the front, and purl. And if you want to bind them off individually, you can do that. I'll do that one on this one here. Okay, there we go. Knit stitch, so no yarn over. And bind off. We've got a purl stitch, so we do our yarn over, bring the yarn to the front, and purl. And move both of those stitches up and over the first stitch on your needle to bind those off. Knit stitch gets no yarn over, and we bind off. There's our purls, so we have a yarn over, yarn to the front, purl, and pass the 2 stitches over that first stitch to bind off. With a bulky yarn, I find it sometimes a little difficult to keep it intact, but it always seems to work out. And bind off. One more yarn over and a purl. And pull those 2 stitches over. I'm going to do these individually because that one feels a little tight. And we just pull a little bit of that yarn through just to firm it up. And so you can see here, here's our cast on edge. It looks like the purl stitch, like it's just rolled right over. And we have a nice stretchy edge here. Everything moves the way it should. It does not mimic this cast on edge, but it's not bad looking and it doesn't cause your fabric to bow out. So here on my second swatch, we're going to do the sewn bind off. So I have here, I've cut a long tail. We're done with this guy here. He's going to move over. I'm going to thread my tapestry needle with a length of yarn. Normally this would still be attached to your ball of yarn. Pull that through. Okay, so the concept here is that what we're going to be working 2 stitches at a time. We have a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch. And in this process, each stitch gets worked 2 times. And we always have something on our needle that is prepared to be pulled off before we pull one off. And it's probably easier just to show you how we do this. When we prepare a knit stitch, we prepare it by purling into it and leaving it on the needle. When we take that stitch, that knit stitch off, we take it off as a knit stitch. So let's begin. We have a knit stitch on the needle. This is a setup for you. We go into that stitch as if to purl and pull our yarn up. Before we can take this stitch, this knit stitch off the needle, we have to prepare the next stitch. And to prepare a purl stitch, we go into it as if we are knitting. So we go right into that stitch just like we were knitting it. And we're going to leave it in place. And when we want to pull off a knit stitch, which this is, we go into it as if we were knitting, pulling our yarn tight, and then we can pull that knit stitch off. So now we have a purl stitch on the needle that has been prepared, and it's followed by a knit stitch. When we prepare a knit stitch, we are going to go into it as if to purl. So we're going to go into that knit stitch purl-wise, pull our yarn semi-tight, and now we're ready to take off this purl stitch. So we go into it purl-wise, and just sort of bring your yarn up close to the very base of the stitch, and we pull it off. Now we have a knit stitch that was prepared, followed by a purl stitch. And in order to get our yarn through this purl stitch as if we were going to knit, we have to come up under the needle with our tapestry needle, like this, and then we go into this purl stitch knitwise, just like that. And now we're ready to take this knit stitch off, so we go into it knitwise, pull our yarn up to the base of that stitch, and we take it off. Just snug it up a little bit. Our purl stitch has been prepared, and so we now need to prepare the knit stitch. And we go into that stitch purl-wise. And now we're ready to take off our purl stitch. So we go into it as if to purl. Let's get our yarn up to the actual base of that stitch, and we can then pull that off. Our knit stitch is prepared, but our purl stitch is not. So again, we're going to go up under our knitting needle with our tapestry needle. Oh, I got hung up. I came through a loop. That felt weird, but we'll be okay. And we go into that purl stitch like we're knitting. And then we can take off this knit stitch by knitting into it. And take it off. Our purl stitch is prepared, and so we need to prepare this knit stitch. And so we go into that stitch purl-wise, and we're ready to take off the purl stitch. So we go into it purl-wise. Just kind of make sure you've gotten that. Pull the purl stitch off. The knit stitch is prepared, but the purl is not. And we need to go into it knitwise, so we go under our knitting needle with our tapestry needle. Go into this stitch knitwise. And then our knit stitch is ready to be taken off, so we go into it knitwise and take it off. Just snug it up a little bit. Our purl stitch is prepared, but we need to prepare that knit stitch. by going into it purlwise, and we take off our purl stitch by purling into it. Just like that. The knit stitch is prepared, but we need to go into this purl stitch knitwise. So using our tapestry needle, we go under the knitting needle and we go into that purl stitch knitwise. And then we're ready to take off our knit stitch by knitting into it. We have 3 stitches remaining. Our purl stitch is prepared, our knit stitch is not. So I go into the knit stitch purlwise just to prepare it, and then I can take off my purl stitch by purling into it. That can be popped off now. Our knit stitch is prepared, but our last stitch, our purl stitch, is not. So we're going to go into that stitch purlwise, and we're going to take off the knit stitch knitwise. Take that off, and that just leaves that purl stitch, which is prepared. We go into it purlwise and take it off. And there you have the tubular bind off. You can see the cast on edge looks very much like it just rolls around into those ribbing stitches, and the cast off edge also mimics the look of the ribbing. And look how wonderfully it stretches, and this makes for a very nice finish. Very, very nice, and it's worth the extra little bit of trouble. So there we go, an overview of ribbing with a couple of cast-ons for you. Glad you joined me today. I'll see you here again on Snowy Owl Knits. Happy knitting!